There you go, Ron.
All right, just let me say I got it. Abani Ghani, everyone. This is Professor Amin Ra, Professor Emeritus of California State University of Long Beach, former city councilman for the city of Compton, former Compton College Board of Trustee member, Compton Unified School District member, as well as a professor for 34 years at Cal State Long Beach in the Black Studies program. I just want to say, along with my co-host, historian Joe Hembrick, a longtime educator, activist, and just a brilliant mind that has contributed to the awakening of Black people through his research and his history as our co-host. We welcome each and every one of you that have come in to listen to this presentation by one of my personal best friends that we've been through so many activities. He was, we first met during the Urban Hakeem and Danifu Urban Hakeem and the Nifu Kyrene struggle when the police shot and killed Irvin Hurst and in the back. And so we've been friends ever since. He's just one beautiful spirit. He helped start the Black Consciousness Conference that's still going strong at Cal State Long Beach. And he put on the logo. Brother Rachaki, could you show the logo? This is the logo that he designed and that was part of the first 5 Black Consciousness Conferences. And we're going to try to bring it back soon as far as the logo to let everybody know about it. But Asar Jubal designed that. Second, he's a brilliant author of classical work. The first one was Black Truth. You got that, Brother Rashaki? On your share screen? Black Truth, where he deal with the whole linguistical history of the alphabet and language and sound, linking it to Japanese language, other African languages, and it was just a brilliant presentation where he spoke all through the conferences and many classrooms about that book. The second one was Black Revelations, a beautiful book. And now he's working on his third book called The Conspiracy of Silence. He's the new Black Revelations about life after death. Talk about mummification and all the things that our ancestors did to recognize death and immortality, as well as his next book, Conspiracy of Silence, which is going to be a classic work. We can't wait for it to get finally published. He's working on getting it published, and we're looking forward for that. But above all, Asar just is here for a little while. He's been living in Cuba for, I think, over 20 years. And he's just been, and he's been to Japan. He lived at least 10 to 8 years. And he's been to Africa for 10 to 8 years. Everywhere he goes, he studies, he researches, and he brings back artifacts as well as documentary evidence of our history as our African people and Black people and our contributions to the forward flow of life on earth as well as after death. So without further ado, we're going to let Brother Asar start and let Brother Hembrick have any comments he'd like to make first. Brother Hembrick?
Yeah, Brother Asar, I don't know if you recall this, but I was coaching football at Centennial, and you came out on the grass and said, "I heard about you," and you handed me your book. You remember that?
No, I'm sorry, brother.
Okay. Well, you know, I still haven't. I read it, but yeah, that was the first and only time I met you. So yeah, you walked up to me and said, "I heard about you, brother," and handed me the book, and you know, I read it immediately. But anyway, I was rereading it. You know, the introduction is outstanding. You know, alone by itself in that book. But anyway, that's it. I'm going to let you get started.
So Jubal, what I'd like for you to do is just give us a little outline about who you are as far as how you see yourself and and why you wrote these books. And you know, you was one of the first students that they had to call the campus police to take you out of history class because you was questioning them for not teaching stuff to make students think.
Thank
And
you.
you challenged the accuracy of their presentation. And the man wanted you to leave the class, you wouldn't, you had to call the police. So go ahead, Jubal. Just tell us all about anything you want to talk about, especially about your first two books and what about the third book and what's going on in Cuba also. Go ahead.
Well, man, thank you very much, all of y'all, for just giving me this opportunity to speak. It's been so long since I've done any public speaking, so I'm a little bit rusty. I've grown old, and we all doing that. But my memory, as far as recalling details, you know, names and dates and all of that's been pretty tough on me. So about 5 years ago, I decided that, look, I'm getting up there now in the years, and I need to copy down what I've learned in the interim since back in the 90s and let people know that I've kind of widened our search for knowledge and for truth. And so that's why I set about 5 years, more than 5 years now, to begin the conspiracy of silence, which is our big enemy, as this book will show, will point out. Black Truth came about, oh my goodness, that was back in 1992, I believe. And a colleague of ours at Long Beach State, Vernell De Silva, I was in one of his classes, and he and I was doing some research into what kind of art, African art, was held in the museums in Europe. And we discovered a book that revealed so much. We were like shocked. You mean they're hiding all of this? So that's what started me down this path, and what led to the Black Truth, the original book. And the big thing about, I think, the Black Truth is that it talks about the lack of definitions given by the Western institutions and research sites about the origin of the alphabet, which is basic. You know, the first thing they teach you in school is ABC. And so what do these things mean? Where did they come from? Who originated them? And what is the definition? You can go to Google today and look up any of those consonant letters, B, C, D, or A, T, M, and they don't give a definition. And neither do the dictionaries, consequently. So Black Truth more or less opened the door on that, what is proven to be a conspiracy to deny the origin of these letters around the world, not only in English. And Conspiracy of Silence, my third book, not only reiterates it, but goes into further detail and comes at it from a historical perspective so we can put things in better context. Now, New Black Revelations, I felt that after Black Truth, I had a couple of readers come up and say, well, you took away my Jesus. And what do I replace it with? So basically, New Black Revelations was written to try to explain what our ancient ancestors in Africa, what they practice and what they believe, not just in Africa, but around the world, wherever you find people of color. So that was the idea with that book. Now, this one, as I mentioned, comes at it from a more of a historical perspective and points out that this conspiracy of silence is much more widely distributed around the world than I had ever thought. And so it points out the discrepancies in the encyclopedias and Webster's dictionary and Oxford's dictionary pertaining to the English, the origin of the English language, and and also it puts it in a historical perspective. So this is not just an oversight. If you read for example, read the, the preface of Webster's dictionary, and I used the 1949 version because it was before the civil rights movement got underway in the U.S. And so there was the whole world was still colonized and by Europeans, and so this was all in place. And so it's interesting to know what the white perspective was as it pertained to people of color around the world. And 1949 was an ideal time to do that because the civil rights movement didn't get underway until mid 50s. So this goes into some of the details of what Webster's and Oxford's and these Western dictionaries, how they misdefine, omit, alter, and just outright lie, really, when it comes to defining the languages of the world, which is important because it puts the hieroglyphs, the oldest writing, into better perspective when you tell it the way it is. And unfortunately, they didn't want to go into Africa. And that's where this whole idea of racism comes into play. Of course, we all have experienced it, so I don't really need to emphasize it too much, but we grew up with it and we still got it, as we all know. So that basically is what conspiracy is. It just talks about some of the things I mentioned in the two earlier books. And now it puts it into a historical perspective. It goes into the history of the Catholic Church, which was in the vanguard of racism, establishing racism with its false story, copied from the ancient African beliefs, and then altered and changed and made into an historical narrative, which is just false. And there's a lot of people who believe that it was true and still believe that it's true despite the revelations brought about by the earlier two books. And so you have to, and I felt I had to go and put this into an historical perspective and show, look, these people set about writing this Christian narrative for one thing. That was to take power in what was in the Roman Empire. And in doing so, they had to crush all opposition to that. So that meant declaring as outlawing any so-called religion that pertained to natural evolution. It came from natural evolution, from nature, the worship or the respect of nature. And they instead come up with this narrative about a historical Jesus who never existed, let alone the so-called 12 disciples and et cetera, et cetera. And that brings us to the St. Peter as so-called the first or the oldest or the first pope, and on and on. So this conspiracy of silence begins kind of there and then brings it all the way up to where we are today, where we see that in reality, these Europeans, beginning in Rome, now almost 2,000 years ago, set about putting into play a political movement, which they called religious, but in fact is political. It gave them extraordinary power. And all the opposition was either murdered or assassinated or driven underground in silence. It took centuries for them to complete that. And it got to the point to where the world, there was no science in the world. And that's what led to what they call the Dark Ages. Of course, they call it dark. The Dark Ages, where there was no research into science. people had only one book to read, and that was their Christian Bible. And then, even then, only the clergy was allowed, and so they could uh, preach from any perspective they wanted to, and it always enhanced and gave power to the Roman Catholic Church. At one point, around the 13th century, 14th century, the Catholic Church outright owned more than one third of all of Europe. And the rest of it, they were taxing, heavy taxes, which eventually led to a revolt against the Catholic Church by the Protestant Church. They were protesting the fact that the church, the Catholic Church, had taken too much power and was just oppressing. It was oppressive system. And so the Black Truth, the Conspiracy of Silence explains this from a historical perspective. And then it explains how the conspiracy of silence has always been in place since they denied and refused to give any credence to the Gnostic religion, which was a worship of nature and was found in every country or every location. There wasn't no countries back then. Every location outside of Europe. And of course, you got to ask, well, how come only Europe? And that's where this whole idea of mutations comes into play, which we again talk about in the conspiracy of silence. Those white people, the Europeans, were originally black folks and who settled there. And then when a worldwide catastrophe around 3,500 years ago, around 1500 BC, froze Europe for decades. And the result was they were not able to travel and intermingle village to village or between villages. And that led to inbreeding. And inbreeding leads to a mutation which takes away melanin, not only physically in appearance, but mentally as well. And that in itself, without going into detail, the book does do the details, but that in itself would explain why, in beginning with Christopher Columbus, only the European countries went out and colonized the world. They literally colonized every country or every land in the world except for Japan, which was too far for them to get to. And the Japanese were kind of a militant society to begin with. And so they resisted having the Europeans come in. And so now they try to justify their control, the Europeans, that is, their control of the world by claiming that their origin is a natural origin, and that by because the appearance that we have, that is melanin, that lacking melanin gives them makes them superior. This is the kind of the kind of theme they're trying to sell, and they've been trying to sell it. But when you question them and when you bring up the science, then of course there's no defense for them. So rather than debate the issues, they take a mute stance, which is what the conspiracy of silence is all about. So that in a nutshell, probably, I think, just sets the stage for what this book, this new book contains. If I just briefly go through what the chapters are, there's 32 chapters in the book. And maybe if I mention the titles of each chapter, you'll get some idea of what this book is about. The first chapter is the introduction, but after that, the chapter 1 is called This New White Magic. And chapter 2 is etymology, which means the origin of words. Well, all the way back to Central Equatorial Africa, and shows how the first human beings developed the sounds that we still use today, especially any acts, verbal sounds, because what we humans can do physically, actively, is limited. So therefore, the names or the sounds that represented these actions still are relevant. And that way, all languages around the world are linked, having evolved from this Central African origin. The chapter 3 is called "The Gifted Amongst Us," which many of us are, and we don't realize it. You know, the ability to use that third eye, which is heavily melanated, and gives you the ability to look into what I call the other world, or the other side, other half of our existence, physical life on earth being one half, the other half being the spiritual or so-called afterlife that comes along. A lot of people have the ability to see into that other world, but because of the disruption by colonization and slavery and genocide in general, we are unable to put things in perspective and understand how we could use this ability to see into the other world to make things better for us here on earth during our physical stay. Chapter 4 is mythology, which explains what the African astronomical mythology, the word mythology, the word myth comes from the word mouth. Well, everything was, before the glyphs were developed, was kept by oral tradition. And so that is by word of mouth and passed down from generation to generation. So what was what we called word of mouth was in fact word of myth and mouth being the same basic term. So mythology comes from that origin. Then chapter 5 is why whites are evil. Well, that breaks it down to a great degree and brings up specific instances in history, and also the inferior complex that they have as being without color. They have an inferiority complex, and they overcompensate for it by trying to dominate society, which, as I mentioned earlier, is why they are the only ones who've gone out and tried to colonize the world. The Chinese, with their 1.5 billion people, and the Indian, likewise, never tried to go out and colonize anybody, because we were all people of color until these mutations came along about 3,500 years ago. So this is what the book begins to point out. It also relates to the Roman Catholic Empire, what its origins was, what it's based on. How did this idea, the concept of a historical Jesus, come into being to begin with? And it didn't begin with the Catholic movement, but actually before that with the Caesar Augustus, who people viewed as the virtual Messiah, having being ignorant of what the origin of the terminology that they were using was at that time. So then chapter 6 goes into Gerald Massey, who talked about these things. One of the few Europeans who was, I think, at first outraged that they had told him this fake story of Christianity, and he believed it to be true. And doing his research presentation, he found out that it was not true. And he was outraged and angry. So he went in and specifically did his own research and uncovered so much that they literally tried to silence him. And in fact, Gerald Massey, who wrote Ancient Egypt, Light of the World, he wrote the Book of Beginning, he wrote the Natural Genesis. All of these things point out to the African origin of civilization everywhere you look in the world. But he was vilified by all of the researchers, the so-called Egyptologists and preachers and bishops and whatnot throughout Europe, simply because he told the truth. And in telling the truth, they literally just ignored him, didn't give him a platform, so to speak. And in matter of fact, I owe the gratitude for having developed the title of this book, because he said after his, I believe it was Natural Genesis, was published back in 1883, he says that my book sold out within a few months, and it was meant by the Europeans with truly a conspiracy of silence. And I could relate to that because having my first two books published, and the same thing happened to me, is rather than debate these issues and, thereby highlight them and bring knowledge to the listener, they just ignore it, pretend it doesn't exist, or they don't know who this guy Jubal is, or Massey. Look, I went through many pains trying to obtain a copy of Gerald Massey's book just back in 1985, thereabouts, when I was at Long Beach State. But finally, we did get a copy of it, and that was a great help to me in researching and learning the truth about so many things. So, and anyway, I hope that gives you some idea what my book is about. And that's without going through. There's 32 chapters. It goes into everything that you can imagine pertaining to the African origins of knowledge, of science, of truth. The Greeks didn't develop anything. Even though everything is accredited to them, they didn't develop anything. All of that was already in existence in Africa before that. One of the last chapters of Conspiracy of Silence talks about the Great Pyramid. It goes into details about the measurements, the angles, the cutting of the stones, the placing them, all of these things which Europeans today could not duplicate, even with all of their so-called AI, artificial technology. They could not duplicate those things. So that, in essence, and I'm sorry I'm being so brief about it, but it gives you some idea about what the Conspiracy of Silence does. It challenges Webster's, Oxford's dictionaries, thereby the English language in general, all other European languages, as being frauds, because they don't go back to the origin of the sounds they use. And the only reason they don't go back is because it's African. So I hope that started you down the road. So it's difficult to answer a lot of specific questions about dates and things, but I take the plea that, hey, I'm getting old, so I'm forgetting certain things. Used to be I could do a 3-hour lecture without any problem. No notes, because everything was just right up here. But nowadays, as I age, I find that these things don't come to you right away as before. But hey, the book covered a lot of it. That's why it took 5 years to get written. So
Okay.
that's basically where we stand with that.
All right, we're going to ask you a few questions about that. Then we got some other issues I'd like to bring up. I'm going to start with our historian, Brother Hembrit. Do you want to start, Joe, with any questions? Are you there? Yeah.
I don't have any questions. I was writing. I missed the name of the second book. It's called Revelations of what?
New Black Revelation about life after death.
No, I'm good, Rob. I'll come back later.
All right, Brother Doctor. Are you there, Brother Doctor? Hello? What about you?
Yeah, I'm here. I'm here.
Okay, good.
Something happened to the screen. I couldn't get to my mute button. Something just changed. But yeah, I just have one brief question. You mentioned some of the subjects in this book, and you got to the point where you said something about the third eye. Can you briefly talk about that? Because you said we lost it. Why? Yeah, briefly talk about that. Why is that important?
Okay, well, first of all, we haven't lost it. we've lost how to use it. Uh, I don't know if all of us, I think we do, all have the potential to visit the other world. And many of us are just simply not conscious of it because it hasn't been taught. It used to be that the seers, the griots, etc., in the villages, passed down their knowledge to each generation by word of mouth, and took into apprenticeship the younger generation that showed the potential for reaching the other world. And uh, but when the Europeans came into Africa, uh, colonizing and then capturing people and kidnapping them, etc., and murdering them, the biggest victims, or the first victims, were the village people, the griots, the seers, the healers, the ones who had the ability to use that third eye, which is a heavy melanated pineal gland in the center of our brains, and which gives you access to the other side or the other world. And of course, since the knowledge of that was passed down from generation to generation, there was a continuity of knowledge in general, which in fact led to the building of the Great Pyramid, which in my estimation is the greatest feat ever in terms of masonry ever accomplished in human history, in human existence, actually. So many of us today still have these abilities, but since the Europeans came in and mercenarily killed off the village healers and the, the teachers, that was the first persons that they really assaulted. And then they tried to replace them with missionaries, so that when these mercenary soldiers would march into the village and start killing and capturing people and sending them into slavery, the ones who tried to escape offered refuge by the missionaries. So the missionaries, they didn't might not have taken up arms themselves, but they benefited by that, uh, by the armies of Europe that came in, sending groups of armed soldiers in to create this havoc. And you had to commit yourself to Christianity. So if you go along especially the west coast of Africa, from Senegal all the way down to all the way down to South Africa, in fact, uh, there's all kinds of fortresses and uh, places that the European used, especially along the coast, where they built, where you find the bulk of the Christians, so-called Christians in Africa, who live along the coast. If you go in the interior, you won't find that is not the prevalent beliefs. But the reason is because of the incursions by the Europeans in Africa. And most Americans, African Americans, came from western part of Africa, from Nigeria, from Ghana, from Senegal, etc. And all along, I've been to all those countries, and all along the coast in those lands, you will find that Christianity is still very strong. And as you go further into the interior, for example, into Mali and Niger and Chad, etc., you'll find that Christianity is not the predominant religion in those countries, simply because the Europeans were at that time incapable of penetrating that far with their missionaries. So I don't know if that answers your question, but we still retain that ability to contact. I know I have that ability, and have on several occasions been able to go through that eye, so to speak, and confirm that this other land, this other world is true and real. But the knowledge we can obtain from having those experiences, the link has been cut from the Africa before the Europeans came to what it is today. And that link is what we need to reestablish. And I feel that the best way to reestablish that is to go back to the beginning and build, find out what the meanings of the terms we use today in all languages in the world, find out what they meant in their original state, how they evolved into what they've become, and establish the fact that with this knowledge, I mean, Africans, early Africans, 100,000, 200, 300,000 years ago, we didn't have no claws, we didn't have guns, we didn't have wings and fins and all of the things that the animal world has. We didn't have anything. What we had was communication, logic and communication, the ability to communicate with one another, the ability to observe the astronomy, which means the movement of the sun and the earth and the moon, etc., and how that affects life on earth. And from that, the predictability of the animals and the plants, when to plant, when to harvest, etc. And that's what led to the development of all science, and it was all based on nature until these mutations came along, and now they want to replace nature with the artificial. So a lot of our Black people today still have that potential to and ability to communicate with the other world. But since the link has been broken between the ancient teachers, the ancient teachers in our villages, etc., and where we are today, we have this gap which has to be filled in. And I think the best way to do that is to go back to the beginning and then bring it back forward step by step. We've got to understand what life on earth was like for our early ancestors, and why and how they came about developing the science as it is.
Go ahead, Doc. Any more questions?
Yeah, I had one more, but I didn't know if you wanted to go to somebody else. Come back.
No, go ahead. Go ahead. We're
Okay,
gonna let
yeah, because what you're talking about, it's just funny, man. I haven't heard this since I was a little kid. I was brought up with the third eye. I haven't thought about it, man. And you bringing back memories. And the other one I was brought up on, I don't know if you can answer this question. It's kind of similar to third eye. It's because you kept talking about communications. And it's the same like now. You can be thinking about someone and all of a sudden they call you. Or I was told back then we're able to communicate like that, just thinking about, we can tell each other something across the world just by thinking about it. It was very heightened. We were able to do that. And I know, like I said, we can still do it now. Like I said, you can think about somebody, all of a sudden you're thinking about a song, the song comes on, think about somebody, all of a sudden they call you. And like when I brought up, I was always told you can communicate with family and friends across the world, and just by thinking, your thoughts, and they can pick up on it. Is that true?
Well, I don't know all of the aspects. I'm sure it affects each individual in a particular way, depending on that individual and their own mental, psychological makeup. For me in particular, traveling to the other world was, there was silence, first of all. There was no sound. There was it's hard to put into perspective simply because so much has been broken between the ancient link and where we are today. But I left or came away from those experiences with the understanding that there is another side to our existence, and that we need to logically recapture the idea that everything that lives on the earth dies. It's temporary, and that it doesn't mean the end. Death doesn't bring the end at all. Instead, it brings transition back to the non-physical spiritual side of our existence. and that these two sides are equal and opposite. They would have to be this balance between this world and the other world. And this is what our ancient ancestors believed and constantly reiterated about this fact of the other world. And that link has been broken. And I think it, more than any other thing, is the biggest problem we face is to reestablish that link. Now, I'm not an expert on the brain or the pineal. I learned about it from, oh boy, here we go with names again. Um, oh boy. Well, anyway, I learned about it from one of our brothers
Dr.
there.
Richard King.
Richard King. Thank you so much, Brian. From Richard King, whom I personally knew years ago. And he pointed out the physiology of the pineal gland, and also that it gave us these other world experiences. But he was a novice at it himself at the time, as was all of us really. But it gave me a springboard, so to speak, to begin research based on the fact that this was there. And then suddenly I started to note things which I probably have experienced my whole life, but just never understood and just passed it off as, well, it's a dream or something. But the experiences that I did have when I became conscious of this ability was I was totally awake. I wasn't asleep. I was aware of my surroundings and where I was, and I had these experiences. And I'm sure that there are a lot of us who have similar experiences. And until we start communicating and communing with one another, then we're kind of going here and there with it. You know, a lot of people with these abilities use it to cast hexes, for examples, and so-called voodoo rites and all of that kind of stuff, simply because they've lost that connection with the ancient science that existed based on that ability. And this is what we need to reestablish. So uh, I can't say by myself just how we go about that, but I know it exists. I know it's real. And I believe that collectively that we can get together and reestablish the link between our ancient beliefs and where we are today. And you know where we are today, so we more than anything need it desperately.
Thanks. Brother Mashinda.
Good evening. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. No, I don't have any questions. I just want to thank Brother Jubal for sharing. I look forward to exploring his writings. And again, I just want to say thank you for sharing. Okay.
No,
All
thank
right.
you.
Brother
Yes, sir.
Rashaki. Brother Rashaki.
Yes, I want to, I have a few comments. I appreciate your work, Brother Jabal. I met you in Professor Amin Ra's class when I was in school, and that was, I would say, early 90s. I would think that was the early 90s. And when you came with the concept of the origin of the letters, the definitions of the letters, I just thought that was very extraordinary. I never thought about it, and it just sparked my interest. So I got the book, I read it, and when I started teaching, I contacted you through Professor Ra, and you were able to come speak to my students, and I thank you for that. It was a wonderful experience for me and the students, and I'm looking forward to reading your next works, because I did also read the second book. So I'm looking forward to that third one. So I appreciate you and your work.
Thank you, brother. I appreciate your comments, and I'm glad you were teaching our students. That's what we need to do. You know, as we discover these things, I'm sure there's a lot of individuals who have had the otherworldly experiences, but they don't know how to put that into context and apply it in today's life. We're too busy just trying to survive, let alone, have the time to do the research and do the teaching. So I appreciate your efforts. It's what we need.
All right, Jubal, this is fantastic. First of all, I want to thank you for coming on, Asante for that. And you always had a wealth of knowledge. And I like the part where you said the dismissal of science and mythology by the European, in his institution. And there's an aspect that the Bible that has no references and is not based on science. It's just based on folklore and stories. Could you explain a little bit more about that whole dismissal? Why literally billions of people believe they tell you about the pandemic, go by the science, but they won't tell you about religion, go by science. Even though they'll say Christian Science.
Yeah.
And that's not science. That's so could you explain a little bit about that?
Yeah. This book really emphasizes the origin of Christianity more so than any other document that I know of, because it luckily it can equate the ancient origin for the sounds that make up the names, for example, Adam and all of these characters, biblical characters, and put it in perspective. And then the Christianity, when it was developed, as I mentioned earlier, right after the death of the Caesar Augustus around 1213 AD. And this guy was viewed for some reason as the virtual Messiah. But the people who wrote these things and developed these early notions had no idea what the term Messiah meant. Well, Conspiracy of Silence breaks it down and takes it back to Africa before these Europeans ever existed. So then you get an idea of this was an astronomical term, and that the center of the astronomical beliefs in ancient Egypt and earlier in Ethiopia and on back to Central Africa, the center of their beliefs was the sun, because the sun literally was God to them. And I mean, it gave life, it sustained life. Without it, we don't exist. And so everything was built around this science that could not be refuted in any way. But these mutations came along and wanting to elevate this Caesar Augustus to the idea of being unchallengeable as the leader of the world. Then they established that he was in fact the Messiah without understanding what the term Messiah meant. And then that led to this big dispute between the Gnostics. Now, the Gnostics were the ancient Africans and others who lived inside the Roman Empire and outside of it as well. But they were all nature worshipers. They believed in nothing can be refuted about nature. It is what it is. It determines life on earth. And so that's what the beliefs were. It determines when you plant, when you sow, when you reap the harvest, how you treat your animals, and et cetera, et cetera. It was the basis of human knowledge. And so when the Europeans developed their concept for a history, a Messiah, or which led to the development of their claims of this Jesus being a physical entity that came into, in some manger somewhere, and wherever it was in Bethlehem or Nazareth, and that this was a historical, physical person Of course, that led to great dispute. And so the first 3 centuries of the Christian era are just chaotic. And matter of fact, the Roman Catholic Church even has banned research into those first 3 centuries. And the reason, a big part of that reason being that they were developing this false narrative called the Christianity as a history, and no one accepted it because almost everyone believed in nature. They depended on nature for their survival. Of course, they believed in it. And the Romans were insisting that this story was true. And then, yeah, it was just chaotic. There was warfare, there was assassinations, there were uh, the corrupting of the ancient Egyptian science by Europeans who did not understand the hieroglyphs. The Romans could not read the hieroglyphs, neither could the Greeks for that matter. And so a lot of what they developed as a historical narrative can be unraveled very rapidly if you have access to the origins of the terms and terminology that they use. That's why that is so important, is to be able to know what the sounds that we make, what it was based on in nature. And thereby you can define what the terms mean as opposed to what these Christians have defined, you know. And so it unravels, literally takes apart this historical Christianity. It is invalid. You might as well write about Superman or Clark Kent or one of them, you know. It's not even a good folks story because it defies science in every way, every way. And so this narrative came about. There was chaos, there was warfare, and then along comes this guy from Austria, this General Constantine. He invades Rome, takes it over, and he decided to go along with the historical story of Christianity and decreed it to be the official religion of the Roman Empire, and no other religion was allowed, permitted. And anybody practicing any other religion, that include all the gymnastics, all of the beliefs in the natural science, were murdered, assassinated, their monuments defaced. The reason you see all that damage done by human hands in Egypt is they were trying to erase all of that. And it got to the point after Constantine, it got so bad that all science became and was not allowed. Anybody came up with any concept dealing with science, which was not a part of the Christian narrative, the New Testament or Old Testament, was denounced. As in the people who were presenting that or challenging that were declared witches. Many of them were burned alive. Man, when this conspiracy of silence goes into the details of just what they did, these Catholics during the so-called, what they called the Middle Ages, which was also called the Dark Ages, to destroy all knowledge, because any knowledge which was permitted would defy this Christian narrative. So, you know, the conspiracy of science breaks it down. It goes into the various popes, how they became popes, and man, you wouldn't believe it. And how corrupt they were, and how immoral they were, and warped they were. Well, a lot of these Catholic priests are today. You know, we know they've been, you know, raping and molesting young or children, etc. And by the thousands, and literally hundreds of thousands of priests. Now, I'm not talking about the victims. That's much, much more than that. But the immorality of this religion and the fact that it is so well established was, I mean, they had unchallenged power throughout the European Empire until the 18th century, the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th, when the hieroglyphs were begun to be translated. This came after the discovery of the Rosetta Stone, which is, I believe, around 1790s, in the 1790s, when Napoleon sent his expedition to Egypt, and they found this stone which happened to be engraved with that ancient glyphs and also with Greek. So they used that as a method of beginning to interpret the glyphs. And this happens at the time when the Catholic Church, it was tremendous power, you know, in the world at that time. And so by the end of that century, the 19th century, the Catholic Church, their power had waned. They just didn't have the religious power. That's when the emperors and all of the colonial powers came to fore and more or less took over the running of the world. And then things were based not solely on religion, but they were based on race, you know. And anybody, the so-called heathen or savages, man, they had all kinds of names to denigrate us. Anybody who was a person of color, it didn't matter whether you was Chinese or Native American or whatever you were, especially African, you were the heathen, you were the savages, you were the animals, the chattel slaveries, etc., slaves, etc. So it was all racism. And in a nutshell, when you really look at it, there's only two races people on this earth. One is people of color, and the other is people without color. It's that simple. And you can't, there's no legislation. I don't care how you try it. And we should know this from our own experiences. Even during my lifetime, you cannot legislate racism simply because it's a biological phenomenon. It's not about law. It's about the biology. You know, these people have an inferiority complex. They use it to try to assert themselves as being powerful, dominant, wiser, richer, on and on and on. And so we need to, and you can see where they brought the world to the edge of extinction, which, by the way, is the title of my last chapter in this book, because that's the age that we're really beginning to realize now is extinction is a fact, and it's an unstoppable fact. And that's what they brought, their science has brought the world to, and it's done so rapidly and tremendously rapid, especially in the last 200 years. Their so-called technology, where they've artificed so much and destroyed so much in nature, you know, with their safaris and buffalo hunts and rounding up all the native people in all the lands and either exterminating them or putting them into concentration camps. The horror, all of this stuff is covered in Conspiracy of Silence in the book. And the horror of it, putting everything in perspective, it's, look, you read this book, there's no way you're going to go back to thinking the way so many of us have been taught to think under the system controlled by these Europeans. And that's why this book is so vitally important, why I wanted to get it done before I pass on to the next world. So I probably got sidetracked by the question, but I hope that I covered whatever it was that now.
Yeah, you used to, you know, there was a book you were writing, but your car got stolen in New York.
Yeah.
And a lot of your literature. What was that book about?
Well, actually, it wasn't a book per se, but it was notes which I had gathered on all kinds of aspects of what I'm talking about. Really, much of what is contained in Conspiracy of Silence. But like you mentioned, my car was stolen. That was all in my car, and I had gone on at the time to Cuba, my first visit down there. And when I came back, then it was gone. The van was gone, the books in it, the papers in it, the notes in it. it set me back just years, literally years. And many of my reference material was in there as well. And at that time, these were hard to find publication. So all my Massey books were in there. And man, Gerald Massey, there's nothing, I can't say enough about the genius of this European from England and his outrage at having been duped by the Catholics into believing in Christianity. And he displayed his outrage by doing the research and then telling the truth, which makes him extraordinary. But you couldn't find his books. So that's how, the effect that it had on me was it set me back years, literally set me back years, losing that material and all of those notations that I had made. So I think as I began to recognize that I was aging and didn't have the instant recall of facts and names and years, etc. When I began to realize that was in my late 70s, and I said, look, I need to sit down and put all of this into perspective, get back to where I was, and bring this truth out to our people. We need this. So I need to do this before, my mind is completely gone, or, the facility is diminished to the point where I'm not able to really recall certain things. So I wanted to do this, and it's taken, like I say, a little over 5 years. I planned on 3, but then the pandemic came into place, and that slowed things down, etc. But it might have been a blessing in disguise because I've been able to edit and re-edit and add and take away from, some of the redundant things that I mentioned in the book. So this is a edited book, and I would like to say it's condensed, but in fact, it's grown since the pandemic began. So,
Okay. I want you to talk a little bit about your travels. I know you went to Egypt with Dr. Ben,
yeah.
and you left the group and you went and looked at what you wanted to look at. They got angry with you. Then second, about your travels to Japan, to Africa, and to Cuba.
Yeah. Well, first of all,
How long you stayed in Africa, how long you stayed in Japan, and how long you stayed in Cuba?
Well, I went out of this country in, oh my goodness. Well, you really tested me. Back in I think it was 57, 58, way back in the day, is when I first traveled to Japan. And man, I explained it in the introduction, one of the, I didn't know what it felt like to be free until I left the US. Oh my goodness. I couldn't believe the Japanese people who, were being called slope heads and slant eyes and all of these redneck names by all of the, I was in the Navy at the time, all of my crew members on that ship, that's how they referred to them. And trust me, when I first went ashore, within a day, these people accepted me as who I was. They had no racism, no animosity against me. I had never experienced that in all my life. I said, oh my goodness. And so this is what really intrigued me to the point to where I didn't even want to come back to the US. I didn't. So, naturally the ship I was on at the time went over there for 6, 7 months at the time, came back. And as soon as I got back, I started working on going back to Japan. Anyway, I ended up going back within a year of having to return from the first visit. And then I lived there for almost 12 years. So during that time, I learned Japanese. And when I came back to the US many years later and began my research, I was telling you earlier about Vernell De Silva in Black Studies Department at Long Beach State. When literally I began my serious research when he showed me this book about what these Europeans were hiding as pertains to Africa. And that started me down the road that I went on. And I had no idea that me being able to speak Japanese was the key, because when I got into the hieroglyphs, into the glyphs, my goodness, there I saw the origin of English and Japanese. And I said, wait a minute, how can that be possible when in fact there was no connection between Japan and England until around 1865, 1866? How could the terms, especially the verbal terms, be the same? You know, because they both, all of them, had come from an African origin. And so that's really what got me going. So my years in Japan just really paid off. It's like, wow. I don't know whether that was it was ironic, I should say, that I had learned this language, and the language, Japanese, was uh, not only similar, identical in most instances. Even though nowadays the way we pronounce things, well, you know, you have differences in pronunciation based on geographical separation or isolation. So, but basically, when as you trace the etymology, the origin of each language, you find that they've come together, and in the hieroglyphic dictionary, there it is for each language, you know. So anyway, that's what started me on that route. I went with Dr. Ben. Oh man, I can't remember exactly. It was in the 80s. Um, Along with a few other scholars, we went on to Egypt, and I remember Jamal. You remember Jamal Gori, who was used to do a program on KJLH there in LA, and he went along with it. And so he and I kind of agreed beforehand that we're going there to uncover facts about us, African people, not these Arabs, and what they had to say about the various monuments in Egypt. And you know, I don't like to bring this up, but you know, Dr. Ben and I didn't see eye to eye on that, because he had bought a large, it was like 85 people in the group. And one day he stopped me, and me and Jamal was off, you know, filming, making our uh, videos of stuff to bring back and explain to people. And he asked me how come I wasn't with the group. And I said, well, the group is with these Arab guides who don't know anything about Egypt. You know, they just repeating what the Europeans told them to repeat, you know. Now, what do they know about they were the invaders? It'd be like asking the Europeans about the culture of the Native Americans they murdered, you know. So uh, so I had no interest in what these Arab guides were saying. And so each day at the end of our uh, journeys to visit the various sites, afterwards we get back, and then uh, Dr. Ben would hold a meeting and sum up what the day's activities were all about. And me, I'd have, well, I didn't plan it, just people gathered around. They wanted to know from my perspective what I thought about these various places. And it had nothing to do with the so-called history of these places, but rather it had to do with the 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 thinking of the personality that made these monuments in the first place, in the religion that they practice, and not what these Europeans were saying as far as history. So that you know, led to another thing, and then eventually we came back to LA, and I've started my lectures a lot and writing as well. And finally, I went on to Africa and lived in Ghana and lived in Senegal and lived in Mali, all in West Africa. And man, I learned so much more, because African people, by and large, were very civilized people. Maybe not in terms of having tall buildings and streets and cars and all of that stuff, but in the way they treated each other. And that the problems that exist there today are not homegrown problems. These are problems that came about due to the European incursion into Africa. Every boundary in Africa, there's 53 countries now, every boundary was drawn by the Europeans. You know, I don't know if you remember the Potsdam, or you don't remember, but heard of the Potsdam Conference in Europe, where literally they sliced up Africa. If you look at the boundaries on a map today, you see all these straight lines. It was like cutting up a piece of pie, you know. They used to call it British West Africa and French, French West Africa rather than British East Africa and South Africa. All these European colonies, and they were split up amongst themselves. Even though these Europeans were fighting each other, they still managed to slice up Africa like you would a piece of pie or a piece of cake and pass it around. This is yours, this is mine, etc., etc., etc. So I learned all of that from having sojourned there in West Africa, and bringing all of that into context was what led to the writing of the books, the first with the Black Truth, and then with the New Black Revelations, which was more to address the religion, more or less, the African religion. And then since that time, I've had these last 20 some years embarked on that aspect even more so, to explain to us, look, in a nutshell, we believed in nature, simple as that. And the central piece was the sun, because that's the solar system that we live under, and it controls our life. It's the regulator of everything we do. And nowadays, when these mutations came along and started building their machines and digging up minerals and fossil fuels and burning and constantly artificing in search of new weapons and speed, you know, trying to fly a jet around the world in 24 hours, all of this kind of stuff is what has brought the environments of the earth to the point of how I conclude my book, to the point of extinction. And we're well into that extinction, began when they began 3,500 years ago. And trust me, it's irreversible. But we should not think that, oh, well, that's the end for life on earth. No, life will continue. It'll just change. You know, at one point, you remember the dinosaurs? They ruled the earth at that time. Life didn't end because of some astronomical phenomena, but it altered, it changed. And the same thing is happening even as I speak. As we know, with all of these now viruses, which this is just the first, you know, others are going to be coming, and we have to understand that. And we have to try to reestablish the African thinking, the natural thinking, and preserve as much of the environments as we can, based on our respect for the solar system and the natural environments that we live in today. You know, you got 193 countries. Yeah, you crazy? 193. That means each one of these have a different set of rules depending on, you know, their own thinking. It can be totally opposed to their neighbor, you know? So nothing is shared. But when you look at nature and the environment, the sun doesn't know nothing about no 193 countries. The rain doesn't know about that. You know, it covers and affects the whole earth. And you look at this so-called United Nations, and it should be one nation. It has to be. And it's like, it's impossible to establish such a thing. But trust me, sooner or later, probably too late, we are going to understand that this is one tiny little speck, this earth, and that it's controlled by that sun, period. And that you can't escape from the gravitational pull of the sun. You know, some comets leave and come back 1,000, 2,000 years later, pulled back by the gravitational. So you don't leave this solar system, because if anything physically left this solar system, that would throw the whole universe out of balance. There is a natural balance that exists. And this is something part of the teaching of our ancestors, and is what people have gotten away from. Emphatically, our ancestors says everything is equal and opposite. You know, at any given moment, the earth is half lit by the sun and half dark by the darkness. It's half lit and half dark at any moment. It never changes. Now, earth might spin, but the sun is right there, illuminating one half of it at any time. And so everything on that is equal to the other side, dark and light, light and etc. And so these are the things that our people understood. That was the science that drove us. And it's the thing that we've forgotten, replaced with these missionaries, the historical Jesus, you know, walk on water, virgin birth, all of that folkloric stuff. And it's taken us away from our center, which is the center of which saw life after physical life and life before or during physical life as being equal and opposite part of our existence. So I hope that explains somewhat about how my living in the Orient, in Japan especially, and then in Africa, and now I live in Havana, Cuba. Well, yeah, you did ask me what's going on there. Right now, it's physically tough because of the blockade thrown up by America against Cuba, simply because of the politics involved, you know. But Cuba is a place where you don't experience the same kind of racism that we experience here. There is some, don't get me wrong, because I said it's a genetic factor, but it certainly is not as prevalent as is here in the US. This place is terrible when you think about it. And it has many pluses. It's a socialist system. That means it looks to the welfare of the people. There's some corruption, not much, but most people are not rich or super rich in comparison to a place like the US, where part of the things I've noticed is like the 41, I think 51, I don't know exactly, the 51 richest people in the world own like 90% of the resources, the money. So these are the kind of things that Cuba is against. So in a nutshell, that's saying it.
All right.
A little bit.
Okay, we're just gonna go around for closing questions. Then we're gonna let you go. And
Okay.
when you plan to go back to Cuba?
I'm going back here in a couple of weeks.
Okay.
And I don't know how long I'll be this next time. I was hoping to go and come in every couple of months like I had been up until the pandemic began. But now, and the flights there is no flights. So I'm going back. I already tried to check into getting a flight to come back to the US, but there is none. So we're hoping that things will open up beginning in the middle of November, and then I'll be able to go back and forth as I had prior.
Okay. Brother Hembrick, do you have any questions? That's closing question?
Yes, well, yeah. One is the book on the conspiracy done yet? Number two, I want to get back to the doctor's question when he was talking about the pineal gland, and Brother Jabal was talking about his astral journey. I've been taught what it's called, and I've been, doing doing some research on that. And I just want to run this by him, and he can let me know if I'm on the right path. Because I'm all about nature and the sun. I sit out there daily in it to what I was told, kind of building up my chakra in my body through my melanin that can give me access to that other world. And also, I was told that, the Ankh is very important, like in that process in terms of getting there. So I just wanted him to further elaborate on that, let me know if I'm on the right path where I'm going. I'm definitely doing the research on it and just what he thinks of that and how he conducted his to go there also.
Well, thank you, brother, if I understand you correctly. First of all, my experiences, I believe now in hindsight, I think I've always had those experiences, and I'm fairly certain because a lot of people don't recognize it when it happens to them. But I feel like all Black people who have a melanated pineal would be able to have the same experiences. This is a non-physical part of our body. When we die, everything stays here on this earth, period. Every hair on your body, every part of it stays here. But in ancient Egypt, the highest ceremony or metaphorical ceremony was of the personality of the deceased being placed on the scale opposite the feather, which is the truth of knowledge. So these two things had to be in balance so that we understood that in order for the deceased, the personality, to continue on into the next world or the next life, these things had to be in balance. Well, you look at birth, life here on earth, where the child comes in and they look like their mother or their father or their uncle or somebody, the grandparents, but the personality of each individual is unique, even within the family, often inexplicably unique. And that personality is what comes with birth, physical birth. And it is above physical birth, part of it, obviously. And during our stay here on earth, it's required that we obtain as much knowledge in all of our experiences, good and bad, form the personality that will continue after we pass on. Everything physical is buried. That personality goes on into the next life, the next world. And that is the essence of our existence. So for me, existence is, the term existence simply means this physical and spiritual existence that is equal and opposite, always in balance. I don't know if I answered your question in total.
No, he asked you also about the Ankh.
Oh, the Ankh. By the way, I wear mine from time to time. The Ankh as a symbol, and matter of fact, what you go back to the scene of the weighing of the personality against the feather of truth, and truth and knowledge. The Europeans always said it was the heart of the deceased, but it's not the heart. The heart is buried with the body, so it could not be. It has to be the personality, which is non-physical. So once the person has their personality placed on the scale against truth and knowledge, then once they pass through that scene, then the Osiris, which represents existence for all of us, is offering this Ankh to the person. He's holding out his hand with the Ankh into it and giving it to the personality or the spirit of the deceased person to say that you have immortality. And this is what the Ankh represents. Now, we know the European calls it the symbol of life, but it's not just life. It means not, the minute you say life, you think, well, physical life. But the Ankh is symbolic of both physical and spiritual life, the whole thing. In a nutshell, the whole thing. And that's why it's offered at that in that ceremony. It's the highest ceremony that we can imagine that the humans developed as metaphor to explain are going on into the other world. And in terms of the pineal, well, as Dr. King had pointed out years ago, that the pineal gland is heavily melanated. That when we go to sleep at night, it literally functions as an eye. Even the Western scientists, if you want to call them that, researchers admit that this has a complete, like an eye, a third eye. The ability to see into the other world, to confirm that there was another side, another half to our existence. And it really makes sense when you take into consideration just how big the universe is. You know, a lot of us have no concept of just how. I was looking at a picture today of my granddaughter here in the desert, and there's some model standing in the middle of all of these sand dunes rising. And I remember reading somewhere that there were more stars in the in the galaxy, that this galaxy that we live in, and the accompanying the closest galaxies to us, that there are more suns. A star means a sun, like our own, than there are grains of sand on the entire Earth. So that I know it's beyond the human concept, the mind's concept to visualize or to even imagine, but that's how big this universe is. If you take into consideration just this galaxy that we live in, the so-called Milky Way, which is a misnomer, which Conspiracy of Silence breaks down. If you consider that the two most distant stars in this galaxy, from one end of it to the other, this is only one galaxy, mind you, it takes light 70,000 years, light years, to pass from one end of this galaxy to the other. Now that's moving at 186,000 miles per second over 70,000 years. So, and this is just one galaxy. And beyond this galaxy that we live in, there's like 200 billion other galaxies. So I don't know. I mean, it's hard to think that we are unique and that when we die, that's it. You know, we did our thing and that's it. It doesn't end there. We just transit. It's like graduating. And you go on to the next part of your sojourn in existence. And this is what our ancestors emphasized over and over. And the doorway to proving that point is the pineal gland, that eye that opens when you go to sleep and you turn off all your physical senses, you know, the sense of taste, hearing. The five senses are literally put to sleep. And then the pineal click, opens up, that third eye opens up. It secretes melanin, which flows into the various melanocytes, you know, which is the skin and the reproductive organs, which are heavily, in the case of us, heavily melanated, and it recharges them, refreshes them, so that you wake up and boom, you're recharged. It's like you plug in your cell phone at night to recharge it, and so was what happens to us physically. But in the meantime, during that charging sequence, when we're asleep, we have these visual experiences. And it's incredible. Sometimes it's three-dimensional, and it doesn't only occur when we're asleep, it occurs when we're awake. And most of the healers and griots and teachers in our ancient villages, the seers, had the ability to utilize that eye during full consciousness and learn from it and teach and offer advice and healing to our ancestors, to the village in general. So they were held in high esteem in the village. And they passed down that knowledge orally, which is why the oral tradition was so important. And unfortunately, it wasn't recorded until after this Christianity came into being. And then when they attempted to record it to counter this fake story, Christian story, they were called the ones who were in fact fabricating when we were the ones who were speaking the truth. So all of these things are noted in my book. So like I said, it took me 5 years to do this and put it all together. Well, it's taken 40 some years of research, really, when you think about it. And just trying to put things into context. And the book explains the details, which much better than what I'm able to do now, because as I age, I don't have the ability of instant recall anymore. So but the book, as I wrote it, I had time to consider various aspects of it and put things into context. And I'm sure that everybody, all folks, black and white, all around the world will get a lot from it.
All right, thanks. Brother Doctor, you have any questions?
Yeah, just the last question. Yeah. He just spoke about, the wealth, the virus, talked a lot of stuff about racism, United States, Japan. I just want his opinion. Where do you see America 7 years from now?
Well,
and I'm picking 7 because that number is kind of deeply rooted in numerology, spiritually, everything is kind of like that one number. What do you think? The America and Black people in the struggle here in the 7 years from now.
Right. Oh, well, I never thought about it in terms of actual years as such. My notation in this book is that we began this cycle, this extinction cycle, about 3,500 years ago, when the earth was pummeled by meteor showers that created the downfall of Egypt for one thing, and the birth of the mutations, the white people in Europe for another, and that this has manifested itself more and more deadly to life as we know it in the interim. And now in the last 200, just generally speaking, this has accelerated to the point to where it's not going to be stopped. I don't care what kind of AI that they create. The more they create this artificial so-called intelligence, the more devastating it is for natural life, because now you're trying to establish a world where it'll be robots. The only thing that can survive is robots, So whether that'll occur 7 years from now, I don't know. I was telling Rod the other day, look, when I came back from Cuba a couple of weeks ago, I had never been on the internet, and that was by choice, because they do have a limited internet services there. but I just never felt the need for it. And I felt that it would be a distraction away from my purpose in bringing knowledge to our people with the conspiracy of silence. So I didn't get caught up into all of that kind of stuff. And really, the last chapter of my book is called Extinction. And it's nothing you should be afraid of, because in the end, we all got to die. All life is here temporarily, and all life feeds some other form of life. But I couldn't say where we'd be in 7 years. I believe in my heart, without, and this is just that, heartfelt rather than scientific, that we'll be in much worse shape, this world in general, than what it is today. This pandemic, I think, is a good example of what we face, because this thing, obviously, viruses exist all around us all the time. And when they mutate, they're adjusting to the environmental changes, the environment of Earth. That's why I say the sun was such an important factor. It regulates life on Earth. So when you poison the environment to where the sun is not able to continue its natural state, nature will always seek to rebalance itself, And the rebalancing means the creation of mutations, which this virus is. And, you might try to inject the vaccines, et cetera, to overcome it. But trust me, it's a temporary solution. There'll be others to come. So it's not anything to be fearful of. What I find more fearful than any aspect of physical death is ignorance, because I know that what our ancestors considered the highest of all was the knowledge. Knowledge was the key to immortality. So knowledge is what's important, and the opposite of that is ignorance. And you can have intelligence, but if you don't apply that intelligence toward obtaining knowledge and truth, then that means you're in fact supporting ignorance. And that's where too many of our people are today. All you got to do is go and see how we fill up the churches every Sunday. These are lost people, all with the potential to see into the other world and to understand that nature is the law on this earth, and not these white inventions, as artificial, as internet, this smartphone, all of that stuff. It's a temporary, these temporary artificial things are destroying this earth. And I think it's gotten to the point where there's no turning back, no matter how optimistic certain scientists come up with, we can reverse this. It's too late. It's too late, much too late. We've been on this extinction cycle, as I said, for the last 3,500 years, and it's just manifesting itself more and more today as we see it's affecting environments all around the world. And I believe that is going to continue. So 7 years from now, who knows? I wish I could say, but I'm not a person who looks into the future and reads it and makes a statement as pertaining to time and place and all of that. But I would just say, generally speaking, it's imperative that we teach our people to obtain knowledge based on nature, and try to put into context try to understand what has happened to us as a people historically, why we're in situations that we're in today, what caused that. And there has to be a natural answer for all of this. And this is what the Europeans have incessantly worked to keep away from us, this ignorance, keep us in ignorance, keep us marching off to their chapels and churches every Sunday, and singing praises to this mythological creature, Jesus, that never existed.
Okay. Brother Mashenda? Thanks, Doc, for the excellent question. Brother Machinda, are you there? Brother Rashaki?
Yes, I'm just, elated with the information that Brother Jubal just brought to us. It just takes me back to Black Studies classes, and it's just, it's good to hear, and I'm glad that we'll be able to share it. I appreciate your information, brother. Keep up the excellent work.
Thank you.
Jubal, we want to thank you for your presentation. You know how close me and you are. Man, we couldn't even get into the equating the equinoxes you used to go into, and all the other subjects that your wealth of knowledge and experience in your travels, and it's just a beautiful thing. And I really want to thank you on behalf of me, Brother Hembrick, and all those that listen. This will be on a platform for other people to access, and Brother Rashaki is going to speak to that as he announced our next program this Wednesday. And me and Brother Hembrick is on Monday, and Brother Rashaki and his network is on Wednesday. So he'll close us out. Again, thanks. Tell us all your sons and in-laws and everybody, we appreciate them helping you get on, and just a beautiful thing. All right, and looking forward to the silence of the conspiracy of silence. Brother Rashaki, why don't you close us out?
Okay, so on Wednesday, we have Dr. Bernard, a naturopathic doctor, going to bring us some information. That should be very interesting, and I can't wait for that. So that's about it. Each one teach one in Conscious Corner.
All right, again, Jubal, I'll be giving you a call, before you get out of here, brother. All right, thank you so much.
So much for having me, and I'm sorry about the memory loss, but hey.
You remembered enough. we appreciate it. All right.
All right, brother. Thank you very much, all of y'all.